Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath, senior editor at Forbes. Tensions between Iran and the United States have ramped up in recent weeks as President Trump has warned that, quote, really bad things, end quote, will happen unless Iran agrees to a deal surrounding the future of its nuclear program. The two countries are slated to hold talks in Geneva on Thursday, and joining us to talk about all of these developments is Stephen Cook. He's a senior fellow for the Middle East and Africa at the Council on Foreign Relations. Stephen, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's great to be with you, Maggie.
So I'd love to start with what sounds like a simple question, but one whose answer I think is quite complicated. How exactly did we get here? You've written about how the U.S. has ramped up its military presence in the Middle East to near unprecedented levels. How did we get here?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think because there's been so much discussion of Iran's nuclear program, people are forgetting the fact that this all began with the massive protests against the Iranian regime and the president warning the leadership in Iran that the United States would take military action to protect protesters. We never did that, in fact, but the Iranians came back in response to those threats and said, well, let's negotiate over our nuclear program. And that has been the dynamic ever since. And the president has flowed massive amounts of military force into the region as part of what is apparently a negotiating strategy to try to get the Iranians to capitulate. But there's a variety of questions around this. One, if you go back to June 22nd, 2025, the president said that Operation Midnight Hammer, the bombing of Iran's nuclear sites, had totally obliterated the program. So what is it exactly that we're supposed to be negotiating with the Iranians right now? Second, the administration has talked about not just the nuclear issues, but also Iran's ballistic missile program and its support for proxies around the region, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Iraqi militias. But there's been really no sense in the one round of negotiations, and now the Iranians are coming back with a proposal this coming Thursday, that this broader set of issues are on the agenda. So it seems to me, to be honest with you, that the Iranians have backed Trump into this corner. He was threatening them because they were killing lots and lots of Iranian protesters in December and January. And then they said, okay, well, let's negotiate. And he took the bait to negotiate. And now they've got him wrapped around the axle over a nuclear program that apparently wasn't obliterated. Last point on this question. I don't mean to go on and on, but it is, as you point out, kind of complicated. We now have this vast number of military personnel and equipment in the region. Trump is going to need something very significant from the Iranians to not use it. And so far, there's not a lot of indication that the Iranians are going to give the president what he wants.
So we talk about what President Trump wants. We talk about the civilian protests that we saw on the ground in Iran and the hundreds, if not thousands, of protesters who were killed. What's most at stake in this moment? Is it the future of the people of Iran? Is it the nuclear program? Is it all of the above?
Yeah, this is, I think in some ways it's all of the above, but it also really depends on who you talk to. The Iranian opposition and oppositionists are horrified by the idea of these negotiations because it gives a lifeline to a regime that in a matter of days killed, as you point out, tens of thousands of Iranians. I mean, they took out heavy weapons and killed people in the streets who are demanding a change of the regime. For the regime itself, the stakes are high in terms of the nuclear program that they have that apparently was not totally destroyed, that they've poured tens of billions of dollars in over many, many years, as well as saving the regime. I mean, there is not an insignificant possibility that a broad American attack on Iran, including regime, might in fact weaken the regime so that the Iranian people could finally bring it down. So the stakes are extremely high. It's highest among the Iranian people because they're likely to suffer whether the United States strikes or not.
How likely are we to slip into a war with Iran? Is that a very likely scenario at this juncture?
like I said before, it's hard to imagine that the United States would deploy all of this force into the region and the Iranians to come up short in what they're going to propose to the United States and the United States not using it. It would be a strategic defeat for the United States to have done this and to send two aircraft carrier battle groups. We have 11 aircraft carriers, but only 3 that are operational at any one time. Sent all of this force to the region to not get what we want at the negotiating table and then not use that force. So I think that there is a strong possibility that unless the Iranians perform in the way that the administration would like them to, this Thursday in Geneva, that the United States uses force in some way, shape, or form. Now, I think there's a lot out there in the commentary that, this is going to be, World War III and et cetera, et cetera. I'd like to kind of inject some reality into this conversation. If you go back to last summer and Israel's attacks on Iran, Israelis really had their way with the Iranians. The Iranians had no answer to them. Yes, the Iranians were able to fire ballistic missiles back at Israel, and I've been in Israel. I've seen that damage. It was quite significant. But by and large, it was a very significant defeat for the Iranians. If the Israelis, let's take it at face value, the Israelis are quite sophisticated, technologically proficient. If they're at that level, the United States is at yet a step above them or a number of steps above them. So I'm not as worried about a prolonged war. What I'm worried about is the United States taking military action, it being successful, Iranians are able to take matters into their hands and bring down the regime, and then chaos resulting. What happens next? Yes, it would be good if this regime comes down, but then what's next? There's really no sense of what's next and what could happen. And I think that's what our allies in the Gulf are worried about, is chaos spilling out of Iran.
2 follow-up questions. I was going to ask you what would happen if the Ayatollah was deposed, if there was regime change. Is there no clear path forward?
Well, look, I think, a lot of proponents of, bringing down the regime through military action would suggest that if you bring down Ayatollah Khamenei, something better would emerge. I think we should know from experience that that's not necessarily the case. So I think we need to be open to a range of possibilities, including, the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is basically the backbone of the Islamic Republic, some remnant or group of it emerging and being able to consolidate power with the help of the Trump administration. That's the sort of Venezuela precedent. Delcy Rodriguez, not a Democrat or anybody, but she's someone who apparently can maintain control of the country. That's a possibility. Reza Pahlavi, the late Shah's son, has positioned himself as a transitional figure. Certainly there are people around him who would like to see it, and he certainly has some measure of popularity there. But I think we don't know, and the Iranian opposition is so deeply divided that I think it's anybody's game should the regime collapse.
And for those who are history nerds, is there anything about the 1979 revolution that's important to have in our heads right now, or that informs this moment?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question, and this has been rolling around in my head. And of course, the 1979 revolution was a formative moment in my life. I was young, but it really began my interest in the Middle East. And I'll point out that as we're speaking, Maggie, Iranian students are engaged in protests at universities across the country. This is the 5th straight day of these protests. Just because the regime used incredible amounts of firepower and coercion in December and January doesn't necessarily mean that this pre-revolutionary, dare I say revolutionary, this moment, whatever it is in Iran, is over. It took about 15 months in 1978 and 1979 for the revolution to really unfold. And so I think Iran is a complicated place, and so we should not draw any conclusions about the kind of lull in protests over the course of the last month, or any conclusions about what might happen should the United States decide to take military action in terms of the durability of the Islamic Republic.
That's a really good point about students protesting, because I think what we saw here in the West were the photos that came out of the protests in January, and it's kind of faded away from the headlines, or at least that part of this story. All the focus is on the nuclear program right now. But if a war were to break out, do you think it's likely that some Iranians would side with the U.S. in that scenario?
It's a great question. I think there's been a lot of conjecture about the possibility of a rally around the flag effect, and I certainly think that regime supporters would rally around the flag. I think that there are oppositionists who have very mixed feelings about, who wants their country to be bombed by the United States, or any country, and then there are, I think, oppositionists who would take help from any direction in order that it brings down a terrible regime, a really terrible regime, one that is profoundly repressive and has spilled a lot of Iranian blood.
That does slip into conjecture, and so does this next question, but it brings us back to what is happening this week. So the U.S. and Iran have had discussions in Geneva, and the next one is happening this week. What do you expect to see in the next round of conversations between officials in these two countries?
Yeah, and let's go back to the previous round where the Iranians left the meeting in Geneva sort of bullish, saying, we've agreed on all principles, and the United States said, well, not really. And so no one really knows what the scope of these negotiations are supposed to be. Is it nuclear only, or is it nuclear plus, ballistic missiles and proxies? In the meantime, the Iranians have said, we're never going to stop enriching. You can't tell us not to have ballistic missiles. And what we do with our partners in the region is our business, not really your business. And so I do know that the Iranians have produced a number of drafts of what they are going to present to the United States. I think some regional partners have suggested to them that they need to be more forward-leaning in what they offer the United States. What I think, though, that is the real sticking point here, I think there's two sticking points. One, the president has been very clear, no enrichment. And the Iranians have said, we're going to enrich. Maybe we can pause, which is really actually technically a meaningless offer. Maybe we can ship it out of the country or whatever. But the president has been pretty consistent on no enrichment. Then the other thing is, if the president is tempted to take a deal that includes enrichment, which would, weaker than what he said, but still a deal, what did the Israelis do? Because the Israelis have been very, very clear that they will not countenance enrichment, especially after the 12-day war, especially after they attacked the nuclear sites along with the United States. And under those circumstances, one cannot count on the fact the United States necessarily restraining the Israelis. The Israelis have been very clear, going back to last spring when the United States began its negotiations with Iran, that it would not be held to an agreement between the United States and Iran.
You mentioned regional partners, and you did write about this earlier this week. So I'm curious, what have we heard from the neighbors in the Gulf? Are they expecting military action?
They have been unwilling to predict, but I think they're resigned to the fact that the United States is going to use military force. I think from their perspective, one, as I said before, it's hard to imagine flowing all of this military force into the region and not using it. And two, they are interlocutors with the Iranians, and reading between the lines, I think they don't believe that what the Iranians are prepared to offer is going to satisfy the United States. Of course, look, a lot of this really depends upon what the president's gut is telling him at any particular moment. So the Iranians may produce something that the president might say, hey, I can live with this. I've been backed into this corner. I can now declare this the greatest deal of all time. And we send the Gerald R. Ford home. And, we all live with the consequences. The Iranian opposition has to live with the consequences that the regime has a lifeline. The Israelis will do what they will do, but the president can proclaim that he has the greatest deal ever. That is a real possibility as well.
What will you be looking for, and what are the questions that you'll be asking your sources in the coming days and weeks? I know there are a lot of questions, but are there one or two or three that are top of mind for you?
Well, still, for me, is what is the scope of the negotiations on Thursday? What actually will it cover? And then the other important piece of this is whether the Israelis can be satisfied by these negotiations. And the Israeli Security Cabinet has met. Israel has said from the beginning, from the time the president said, help is on the way to the Iranian protesters. This is an American operation, but that doesn't mean that they haven't gamed out what they would do if this does not end to their satisfaction.
Before we let you go, is there anything else that you would recommend that the Forbes audience pays attention to or has in their minds as these negotiations approach?
Yeah, I think what you have to keep in mind is that the president doesn't really necessarily have an objective. Yes, he said Iran will never get a nuclear program. Iran can't have zero enrichment. But if he were to order military strikes, the objective to the rest of us on the outside wouldn't be clear. He would tell the military to go, and the military would do what it does, and it does it very well. And then only after the fact would the president declare what his objective was and that it was successful. And that's just the peculiarity of this administration, where there isn't a kind of very clear policy process. And the president has a very, very small group of advisors who have some input into what he does, but really, he has been telling this for us for a decade. He listens to his gut. And that's what makes this a particularly interesting as well as high stakes moment.
High stakes indeed. Stephen Cook, Senior Fellow for the Middle East and Africa at the Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you so much for joining us. As always, we appreciate your time and your insight.
Thanks, Maggie.